The new season of Black Mirror is out, and the first episode is called "Joan is Awful," and it features some legal scenes. There's actually a lot of law behind the plot. There are going to be some spoilers in this video, so if you haven't watched it yet, or they're minor, they're not the super ending, but probably enough. I'd go watch it first. Watch my video engagement go down to nothing right now. But I'm Kevin Kneupper. I'm an attorney at Kneupper and Covey, and when I watched this episode, it was painful, painful, painful watching the two attorneys in this. How bad they were. They were the two absolute worst lawyers in a TV show that I've ever seen in terms of knowing what the heck they were doing. A lot of that is really just dramatic. They need it for the plot to go forward. But I want to explain to y'all why the lawyers were so bad, what is legally wrong in this show, at least in current American law, and what is actually correct and sort of not very good about American law in terms of contracts, which was going on in these scenes. If you haven't seen the show yet, this is where you better jump out if you don't want to see it. So there's the two scenes where if you have seen the show, or if you don't care at all, then you can just listen to this. So Joan is trying to get out of her contract with the Netflix equivalent of in the show, and I'll just call them Netflix because that's kind of the real world, really analyzing what's going to happen in the real world. So Netflix has basically said, "Oh, we have buried deep in your contract that you sign when you click it," and we all sort of click it. And Joan is correct that everybody just clicks those things and doesn't read them. I don't read them. I actually haven't. I don't think I've read the Netflix terms of service ever. I haven't read most of them, even though I sue companies all the time as a plaintiff's consumer lawyer and I'm very familiar with the actual law on these contracts. So in the show, she goes to a lawyer. She's like, "Look, they basically just stole my life. They're making this TV show about me without my permission. How do I stop them? I should be able to sue them." When I was watching the show, I was actually like, "Man, if I could get, I wish that would happen, and someone would come to me as their client because I would sue Netflix into oblivion." That would probably. I actually started thinking like, "Man, I could probably get $1 billion on a lawsuit like that if they really did that to somebody." And so, what really would have happened? So the lawyer in this case, let me show you the first lawyer, who is the first of the two horrible lawyers. This is the woman Joan goes to and is just like, "Sorry, and nothing I can do. It's ironclad. There's nothing you can do because you signed this thing, you clicked I accept, and that means every single thing that's in that contract you're done with. I as an attorney, can find no possible way around this." And that's what makes her just such a horrible, horrible lawyer. So, what are they satirizing? I guess, so, like, because this is an exaggeration of current American law. There is one trend that I hate. I think it actually is really kind of horrible what the U.S. Supreme Court's been doing on this, and they are actually basically taking away your right to court in a lot of scenarios, and that is arbitration clauses. So, what they are saying in the show is not entirely true, but a lot true about what's called an arbitration clause. So, buried in any contract, probably, I think about 99.9% sure, buried in the Netflix contract, and almost every major company, although some have backed off on this now because of lawyers like me shoving it up their rear, is that they'll have an arbitration clause. An arbitration clause says that you cannot go to court. You have to go to what's called a private arbitration. It is people like a lawyer who kind of acts as a judge. Sometimes they're a former judge. They decide everything in private. It's a very narrowed down version of a lawsuit. It's much cheaper. It's much faster. Companies like it because they don't like getting sued, and they really wanted to stop class action lawsuits. Is why they did this, because if you can't go to court, you can't do a class action. And they have this really kind of nailed down by the Supreme Court that has created a few exceptions, but not a lot. There are ways that sometimes you can get out of one of these arbitration clauses, but generally it is true if you click the button and sort of certain conditions are met, like there has to be some um, like a prominent, hey, there's a contract, here are the terms, here's a link to them. It can't be at the bottom of the page. It's got to be near the button where you're clicking. But if that is the case, then those arbitration clauses are the answer would be kind of like what the lawyer gave in this case. But what the lawyer says is something different. She says everything in that contract is ironclad. You clicked it, doesn't matter what's in there. It says basically that Netflix can, for zero money, just ruin your entire life and monitor all your devices and take everything in there and just like show the entire public everything you're doing in private. Oh, by the way, including this current to discuss. That was actually a little craziest, including the current attorney-client discussion, which for some reason we haven't turned our phones off, even though we know that somehow the phone is sucking out both audio and video. That's I also like sci-fi a little bit, so I was a little. There's some sci-fi science things that do not make a lot of sense about this episode either. I like the episode; it was funny, but in terms of science or law, it was very bad. So. In terms of law, is the lawyer right about this? Absolutely not. It does not matter. So you probably would not get to go to court. You probably would get stuck in arbitration. And I do say probably because even sometimes courts other than the Supreme Court will try to find ways around this. And the problem, but let's put that aside. The question of do you have to go to court or do you have to go to this private arbitrator? Can they just stick something in the contract that says I'm going to take up your entire life and doesn't matter and I didn't tell you about it and you just like everybody in the world now Netflix owns us. If they did that, there's something called so there's a concept called unconscionability. So contracts can be challenged for a lot of different reasons legally, even if you sign them. That one example would be something called duress. That's a traditional defense to contracts. That's, let's say someone puts a gun right to your head and says, "Sign this contract." You're going to give me $1 million, or another example of duress. Maybe they don't have a gun. They just say, "Here's a contract. I have your child kidnapped. Sign this contract that says you'll give me $1 million." And then, the kidnapper comes back later and is like, haha, you signed it. The courts would be like, no, it's under duress. That means duress just means under sort of this undue pressure, that's not, looking at it is not fair to hold the person to the contract. That's not something that would really apply here, but that's an example of one of many exceptions to a contract that can invalidate it. The one that I think would nuke this one out of existence is unconscionability. Unconscionability is a concept in the law that says that for contracts where there are contracts and clauses in contracts that can be so one-sided that they shock the conscience. That's where the phrase comes from, unconscionable. So in this case, and it has to be two types of unconscionability. There's procedural and substantive. Procedural would be an automatic in this scenario. Procedural unconscionability means that you have to show that the contract was negotiated under kind of a scenario where one of the parties had much less power than the other to determine the terms of the contract, to write the contract. And the most common of those is whenever a company sticks a contract in that you just say I accept to. You don't have a lawyer. You aren't negotiating the terms. There's no other option to change the contract. You can't be like, I'd like to get Netflix, but without this whole "you can steal my identity" clause. So that would be what they would call procedurally unconscionable because you couldn't negotiate it and you didn't have a lawyer, and it's what's called it's a contract that is basically just standard. And so a contract of adhesion is the phrase that they use. So that's part one of unconscionability. Part two is that it also has to be substantively unconscionable. And that just means that the term itself that you are challenging is so one-sided as to shock the conscience. Well, this one's so shocking that they made a Black Mirror episode about how horrible it would be. So if they really did this in the real world, any lawyer who came to you and said anything other than "let's go nuke them" would be out of their mind. Now the show can't really go forward if they could do that. So that's why they kind of do this, and they are really just like commenting on, I think, the trend of the Supreme Court doing stuff like this with respect to arbitration, the trend of consumers losing rights to these contracts of adhesion that we all click on. That is something that is kind of happening, but I will say a lot of lawyers like me are fighting back on that and very effectively. I'll give you an example. When I said earlier that some companies have dropped their arbitration clauses, one of them, this wasn't me that did this, there were a lot of other lawyers that organized this. These people decided, okay, hey, Amazon, you have like 100 million customers. We're going to go get, I think they got 300,000 or 400,000 people to arbitrate against Amazon, and the cost to Amazon every time is about $3,000 or $4,000. So the amount of that is like over $1 billion. And that's just for the fees. That's not even to pay their lawyers. It's not to do the arbitration. It's just to let the arbitration company say, yes, we will arbitrate this. They would have had to pay $1 billion. And so the news came out. Amazon said, we're actually taking the arbitration clause out of our contract. We'd rather just go to court. And that's the kind of thing attorneys are pushing back on. But so this attorney totally screwed everything up in terms of the legal world. If you walk to an attorney office with that scenario that Netflix had stolen your life, they would be salivating. There's something called a right of publicity law that certainly exists in California, where Netflix would be, and there's gonna be something similar in the common law in any state you're in to some degree. They may be more or less powerful, but that right of publicity would let you nuke Netflix for doing this, and there's probably many other laws I can think of that would invading the attorney-client privilege is totally insane. That would be tortious in and of itself when they just sort of have the AI start reposting that. So this attorney sucks. That's all I can say about her. Let's talk about the next attorney that Salma Hayek hired, who sucks for an entirely different reason. Let's look at this guy in the show. He's probably even more incompetent. And I'd say probably like very even more incompetent than the first lawyer. And he is in the show Selma Hayek's lawyer, who when Joan goes and takes a dump in a church in the middle of a wedding to try to make the AI uh, uh, like put that in the show with Selma Hayek doing it so that she gets mad. Then Selma Hayek does get mad and goes to her lawyer and is like, "Well, I'll sue Netflix," which is exactly Joan's plot. And so this guy comes in and he says, "Sorry, Selma, when we negotiated your your actress contract to give them the AI rights to you with Netflix, we there's a clear clause in there that says." That you're allowed to take dumps on camera, or your AI can take dumps on camera. It's a specific defecation clause they call it, which is funny. And Netflix, I'm sure they don't actually have a defecation clause in any contract. I would be amazed. It would also be funny. And if you're an actor with that clause, you should really show all of us it. But this he basically says you're kind of stuck because you agreed to let them just show you taking a dump wherever to whatever extent that you wanted to do it, and so now that's in the show. And just tells her you're out of luck. And at the end, Selma storms out and says, "Well, I'm going to sue you then." So what's the accuracy of that scene? Actually, all of that interaction is legally accurate. Okay, because in this case, this is very different from what the situation we looked at earlier. What's different about it? The first thing I was talking about, the procedural unconscionability. This guy up here is a lawyer, and so he is the one. Presumably, like the way that they made the sound in the scene is that he had negotiated for Selma Hayek this contract. Well, there is no procedural unconscionability in a scenario where you have a lawyer and you're a big business, and then Selma Hayek's on the other end with her lawyer, and I think her husband's a billionaire, so she would literally be like a billionairess negotiating with a giant billion-dollar company. That's the type of scenario where courts will look at it and be like, you know, you can't really show that the procedure of this contract was in any way unconscionable because um, you're like you guys are the biggest people in the world with the biggest lawyers, and so everybody had a chance to look at this. There's no chance that Selma Hayek's lawyer did not read the defecation clause on paragraph 37 or whatever, and so. The courts would probably say she's out of luck. She had this. You had lawyers who advised you on it. But then the thing Selma says when she's leaving the office that you're the worst lawyer or whatever, and I'm going to sue you for malpractice, is also accurate. This guy, if he let a defecation clause get in there without Selma Hayek knowing about it, it's the type of thing where if you're a lawyer and you saw a clause like, I'm not an entertainment lawyer, but if you saw Netflix trying to show specifically saying we want to show Selma Hayek taking dumps on television, and then you're Selma Hayek's lawyer, and you don't look at that and go, maybe I should check with Selma, or on whether she wants to do that. You have committed malpractice for sure, because the entertainment lawyers, their whole job is to sit there and go over these. That's all they do. The whole reason you hire them is to go over those contracts with a fine tooth comb, make sure that everything is what Selma wants. That there's nothing in there that's gonna screw her. That she's not gonna get some blow up on something, and to read the terms, make sure that everything is, because it's all super complex when they negotiate some entertainment deal. Those things can be 50, 100 pages, any kind of corporate contract. I've seen some that are a couple hundred pages. Those are software contracts for giant companies, like when they sometimes they pay actually north of $1 billion for computer software, which obviously they're going to spend several hundred pages outlining exactly what they're going to do. But this lawyer was totally useless. And if Selma Hayek sued him, she would, I think very, very likely be successful for him leaving in this thing without her knowledge, without, whatever. Um, I so he would get sued. The problem for her with Netflix is that they have this contract that you're sort of looking at it going, it's certainly not procedurally unconscionable. In California, you kind of have to have both. You have to have some element of both at least. So I don't think she could get any of the really that part of it on substantive unconscionability. I don't think it's inherently really like if you kind of want to or are willing to have video of you defecating in a church online. I mean, I don't know that there's anything really unconscionable about it. Like it doesn't shock, it maybe shocks me a little to do it, but it doesn't shock me if someone wants, like, I mean, there are probably celebrities who are like, I'll sell you my OnlyFans rights or whatever. It is not something where you would say that is inherently one-sided, that Salma Hayek would sell her dump video rights to some streaming service because they're you know it, it just isn't something that if she's being paid money that is necessarily one-sided is kind of the idea. It's not just that it shocks your conscience to do it, but that it is a one-sided thing to put in a contract where only one party is benefiting is kind of the idea. And that's what's different between Joan and Selma in the show. So both terrible lawyers. Reason really I want to point out why this is all inaccurate is people start running around and thinking it's true. So even though they are sort of like really just exaggerating for fun, a lot of people will watch this and be like, "Oh no, that's actually the law," and it's not. It is not the law. You can get out of contracts when they're just totally bad. Sometimes you can get out of like NDAs. Sometimes people think that I've seen TV shows like this too. Netflix put out Daredevil, where people were like, "Oh no, the NDAs are ironclad, and they're never really ironclad. They're maybe not never, but there are always, if you got a good lawyer, ways to sort of get around it. If you got a bad lawyer, then maybe they'll just shut their laptop and be like, "Oh, I don't really, I can't figure anything out." So that's the actual law. And if you want to see more videos about this, about random crazy lawsuits and stuff like that, hit subscribe or hit one of the end cards, and you'll see some other, equally insane situation probably.